It had no name, like the man who sat on it, and the horizon it faced hadn't changed in 2 decades. Dirt stayed dirt, wind stayed wind, and stillness became more than just routine. It became nature itself. 20 years earlier, a cowboy had walked up to that porch with boots too loud for the silence. But they quieted over time, cracked, softened, and blended into the wood beneath him until even he didn't notice the weight anymore. No visitors ever came, not even the kind that passed at a distance. The trail had grown over with wild grass, sagebrush, and dry, brittle weeds that folded with every breeze but never flattened from boots or hooves. The dust that swirled across the plains never brought messages, never hinted at change. It only came and went like old memories he no longer chased. Each morning, he sat with his coffee untouched, letting steam curl into the cold air just to watch it vanish. He kept a chair next to his, not for company, but because the porch had always had 2 chairs, and he never found reason to move the other. Coyotes sang at night, and crickets filled the voids between stars. But nothing human had crossed that front yard in 20 long years. He had built a rhythm out of nothing, waking before dawn, oiling his tools though none were used, mending fence posts that never broke, collecting firewood though the winters had softened with age. Inside, the walls had grown to know his silence better than any spoken vow. The bed creaked when he sat, but not when he lay down. A calendar, still pinned to 1905, hung by the kitchen window, untouched by ink. He once marked time, birthdays, seasons, bad weather, but now he let it pass without comment. On the shelf by the window sat a journal he hadn't opened in a decade. Not because he had nothing to write, but because he feared starting again would bring questions he no longer wanted answered. Letters never came. Even the postman had learned not to look this way anymore. The world had stopped knocking a long time ago. And he had let it. Until one morning, the wind changed. Not in temperature, not in direction, but in tone. It wasn't softer or louder, just aware. And though his porch faced emptiness, that morning it listened. Before we begin, tell us, where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Is it late at night? Are you wrapped in a blanket, trying to quiet your thoughts? Or maybe you're just looking for a silent space to rest your mind. Let us know in the comments. And if this story helps you unwind, don't forget to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss more quiet stories like this. He stepped outside with the same boots he had worn for 2 decades, soles nearly part of the porch itself, and he expected to find the same wind, the same light slanting across the same dirt, with the same silences hanging off the same sky. But that morning, the earth was different, not in color or scent or shape, but in the subtle betrayal of its surface, where the dirt no longer held only wind-etched patterns, but something else, something unmistakable, a trail fresh, deliberate, and still dark, with weight pressed into the damp soil like a memory that had decided not to fade. A line of hoofprints arcing across the field from nowhere, wide set and paced evenly, as if whoever rode had no intention of rushing, nor hiding, nor wondering whether they were seen. The trail didn't begin at the gate, which had rusted open years ago. It didn't cross from the old ridge path that hunters once used. It simply appeared from the middle of the land, as though it had risen out of the earth itself, pulled forward by purpose. He crouched near it, fingers hovering just above the imprint, not touching, just watching the slight pool of moisture gather in its depth, not the kind that comes before rain, but the kind that lingers after it, long enough to whisper that someone passed here not hours ago, but minutes. The soil still remembered the iron of the horseshoes, the pressure of the weight, the slight tremble that comes when 20, 30 riders move not for show, but for arrival. He stood slowly, gaze following the prints across the open plain toward The low hills to the west, where a shadow moved and then didn't again, where the grass had been nudged and the wind chose not to go. No sound came with the realization, no rush of fear or flight. Just the steady breathing of the land adjusting to a truth it had not known in years. Someone was coming, or perhaps had already come. And yet, no dust rose, no voices carried. No birds startled. It was the kind of presence the world held its breath for, the kind that filled the lungs of time with the weight of what comes next. He backed away from the trail, not out of fear, but reverence, like stepping from a church aisle or a family grave, knowing it belonged to something that required silence. He didn't reach for his rifle, didn't go for the horse he rarely saddled anymore. Instead, he leaned against the post, eyes fixed on the far horizon where the sun refused to brighten the shapes that might or might not be men. They were waiting. That much he knew. Whether for light or for him, he couldn't yet say. And so he waited too, not for safety, not for answers, but for the trail to tell him what kind of story was walking toward his door, and whether, after 20 years of silence, he would be asked to speak. They weren't just hoofprints, or a declaration, a message carved into soil more eloquently than any letter ever written. 30 sets of hooves. 30 deliberate weights pressing down in the exact same rhythm, so uniform, so disciplined, that the old cowboy wondered whether they'd been carved by animals or summoned by the earth itself in perfect geometric will. Because each one aligned with the next like soldiers on a parade ground where no orders needed to be shouted. No tracks wandered, none strayed, not a single misstep in the muddy line that wound slowly but precisely toward the cabin like a fuse of silence lit in reverse, starting not from him, but from somewhere far and still and older than even his memories. And as he stood there, still barefoot from sleep, blinking through the pale light that hadn't yet committed to being morning, he realized that the prints didn't just mark direction, they marked agreement. As if all 30 riders had thought the same thought at the same time and had leaned forward on their saddles with the same weight, letting that one shared decision etch itself into the land. A covenant of footfalls, a whisper of intention so calm it became eerie. It wasn't just movement, it was precision, and precision meant purpose. And purpose meant they weren't lost, weren't wandering, weren't hoping. They knew exactly where they were going, and they knew who was there. The cowboy followed. The line slowly, boots in hand, heart not racing, but bracing. Like a man walking beside a river that once drowned his brother, respect, not fear, in each step. He paused beside a stretch of the trail where the curve tightened, the prints folding inward like a single thought turning over itself. And he knelt there, placing his palm flat beside the nearest mark not on it, never on it, and let the air settle. The sun caught a glint of moisture on the ridge of a deeper hoof, and he saw it. Not just a trail, but a signal. Because the prints weren't deep from speed. They were deep from weight riders, heavy with something. Not just gear, not just weapons. But memory, or maybe grief. A slow procession, not a hunt. A chosen path, not a desperate one. And that made it heavier. The prince went around the wild thistle he'd never managed to pull out, swerved gently to avoid the black stone where his horse once tripped, and he knew they saw. They knew the land like he did, or maybe better. They didn't need to ask for directions because the dirt already spoke their language. And suddenly, he felt as if he were the one trespassing, as if his cabin was the unexpected thing, not their arrival. The line continued toward the gate, which had never been closed in his time because nothing ever came. It passed under the dead arch of the vine that hadn't bloomed since the day his wife left. And it passed over the shadow of the windmill that no longer spun. The tracks honored the place, but they didn't pause for it. They had no need to remember because they hadn't forgotten. 30 riders, 30 sets of thoughts, so synchronized they might as well have been the limbs of one body, and he knew, without knowing how. that if he were to follow the tracks in reverse into the wilderness from which they had emerged, he would not find 30 stories, but one. And it wouldn't be written in journals or recounted in saloons, but in the way they breathed in sync when the chill came, the way they signaled to each other with nothing but glances, the way their horses paced without reins, because riders like that didn't need plans, they were the plan. And now the trail ended at his porch, just below the steps, where 30 prints stood still. Facing the door, not scattered like wanderers, but gathered like messengers. And the air didn't shift with movement because there wasn't any, only presence, the kind you don't hear approach but feel settle. Like dust after a long storm, or like justice that doesn't come loudly, just finally. There was no sound, not even the distant clink of metal against stone. Not the rhythm of hooves, or the creak of leather, or the murmured commands riders usually give to their horses when approaching uncertain ground. And yet, the earth trembled. With the memory of motion, not violent, not fast, but certain, as if it carried within it the pulse of 1,000 steps taken in reverence, not fear. And the old cowboy, who'd heard every kind of echo in that open land wind scraping over dry grass, foxes darting between brittle roots, the brittle clatter of rain on rusted tin, felt something deeper now, not in his ears, but through the soles of his boots, up into his knees, as though the dirt beneath his home was trying to tell him a story. It had kept buried for too long, a story it could no longer carry alone. Because the silence wasn't silence at all, it was a language older than voices, spoken through pressure and pause, through the weighted steps of beasts that walked not with noise but with knowledge. And what the cowboy felt in that stillness wasn't emptiness, but intention. Like the hush that comes before a verdict is spoken, or the breath just before a name is said aloud for the first time in years. And he understood then that these riders, whoever they were, whatever they sought, did not announce themselves because the ground already had. And the message had arrived before the messengers did, etched in a series of muted thuds that traveled across miles and years, carrying with them not threat, not demand, but presence, the kind that doesn't need an introduction because it was never truly gone. And he stepped off the porch, not to meet them, but to meet the feeling. The way a man approaches a grave he's only recently learned the truth about, not quickly, not casually, but with the slowness of someone who knows the weight of every second. And he knelt once again, not in submission, but in listening, placing his hand flat upon the path and feeling the warmth that still clung to the dirt, as though the hooves had passed not moments ago, but now. This very instant, their echo so soft it never rose to the ears, but lingered in the bones, and he closed his eyes, breathing with the rhythm of the land, not his own. And for a heartbeat, he felt himself part of something not entirely human, not entirely past. Something stitched together by purpose and dust and patience so vast it made years feel like minutes. And when he rose again, the prince had not changed. The stillness had not lifted, but his chest had for the first time in decades. His chest had lifted with meaning he had not given it, and the air around him, though quiet, felt full. Like the moment just before a storm breaks or a song begins. And he thought then of all the years he had guarded this land as though it were something to be owned, protected, endured, and he saw how small his efforts were, compared to the silent covenant being written now across his threshold. And the earth spoke again, not in words but in weight, in the compressed memory of hooves that remembered more than any man, in the alignment of footsteps that made the dirt itself resonate with truth. And the cowboy finally understood that this wasn't a visitation, it was a continuation, that the ground had been waiting for them, and in waiting had become fluent in their silence, and in that silence had carried their voice all the way to his door. That morning the cowboy stepped out as he had done for 20 years, boots to wood, breath to wind, expecting nothing and asking for even less. But the air told him things he hadn't asked to hear, because the dust that lingered wasn't his. Owned not from his steps or his porch or his past, but from something else, a motion too recent, too careful, too organized to be mistaken for accident. And as he stood there, arms heavy with the memory of stillness, he saw not the riders themselves, but the aftermath of them, written in the haze that swirled not with chaos, but with pattern, with rhythm, with meaning that belonged to another. Time, another set of rules, a dust that rose not in rebellion, but in ritual. As though every grain in the air had been invited to dance by the deliberate pace of 30 hooves. And he did not move forward because the world had already done so without him. And now he was simply a witness, not a participant, not yet. And the path before him shimmered, not with heat, but with history. And the shimmer wasn't from sun or shadow, but from memory, thick and suspended in the wind like a breath that no one wanted to release too soon. And as he looked across his land, he realized something had shifted subtle. Yes, but certain. And the certainty was more terrifying than surprise, because it meant this had been planned, orchestrated, maybe even rehearsed. And he was not the first to see it, not the first to feel it, just the last to know. And still, the dust moved, curling around his legs, not as an embrace, but as a reminder that even the wind knows when it is following and when it is leading. And this time, it was not him it followed, not him it danced for. And in that realization, something long hidden inside his chest stirred, not regret, not quite, but recognition. Like the first note of a song he thought he'd forgotten, and he turned slightly, just enough to face the road, not to chase the dust, but to accept it, to allow it to pass, and to understand that not all journeys begin with a step. Some begin with stillness, and the cowboy, who had once believed silence was his shield, now saw it had been a wall. And the dust that lingered beyond that wall was not a threat, but a message. A parchment written in earth and sky, and he read it with his skin, not his eyes. Because this was not a story told aloud, it was one felt, bone to soil, breath to wind, and the trail it left did not vanish like others before it. It remained, stubborn and soft, waiting not to be followed, but to be acknowledged. And, as the cowboy stood in that doorway with nothing in his hands and everything behind his ribs, he knew this was not their arrival, but his own. For the dust that hung in the air was not evidence of strangers. It was the voice of something older than loneliness, more patient than grief, and far less forgiving than time. And it had waited long enough to be noticed, and now, with a weight of decades behind him and the lightness of dust ahead, he did what he hadn't done in years. He stepped into it, not to disturb, but to remember. It was a part of the yard he hadn't looked at in years, the kind of corner that existed more in memory than in use, where wind would pile leaves in autumn and forget them in winter, where no footprints lingered because no one bothered to stand still long enough. But that morning, as if drawn by something not quite sight or sound, the cowboy turned and sought the saddle, weather-worn but not abandoned, old but not forgotten, and the way it leaned against the low wall spoke of quiet hands and careful timing, not of haste or panic, but of someone who knew what stillness meant, someone who understood how to leave something not to be found, but to be noticed. And he knew immediately that it hadn't been there the night before, because the dust beneath it was undisturbed, which meant it had been placed gently, deliberately, and with purpose. And the shade that covered it wasn't just from the roof, or the time of day, but from intention, as if the person who left it knew sunlight would make it too loud, too obvious. And this, whatever this was meant to be whispered, not declared. So he stepped toward it not with urgency, but with reverence, like approaching a grave or a gift. And every creak of his boots felt like a question, every breath like an intrusion. But still he moved, because this was not just a saddle, it was a message. A chapter from a book he thought had ended 20 years ago. A reminder that stories don't close, they rest, waiting for the right page to be turned again. And as his hand hovered above the leather, he didn't touch it, not yet, because touching would make it real. And for a few more seconds, he needed it to stay mysterious. Needed the silence to hold it, to preserve the weight of it before action stripped it of its meaning. And in that pause between intention and motion, he saw everything not in memory, but in knowing the rider who had carried it, the reasons he no longer did. The hands that had once cinched it tight, and the journey that had ended too soon, or perhaps not at all. And he understood that this saddle was not his, not anymore, maybe. Not ever. But it had been brought here, into his yard, into his silence, not for him to claim, but for him to see. And in that seeing, to accept that something was unfolding around him, not in confrontation, but in invitation. And that perhaps the years of solitude had not been punishment, but preparation, not emptiness, but clearing. And the saddle, sitting there, quiet in the shade, was not waiting for a rider, but for recognition. And maybe that was all it needed, not a journey, not a horse, not even a voice, just a witness, someone to look at it and nod and say, in the deepest quiet of their heart, I see you. And so he did, without moving a muscle, without taking a step closer. And for the first time in 20 years, the cowboy felt as though something in the world had spoken his name. Not aloud, but through presence. And that was enough. Because sometimes, it's not the thing itself that matters, but the silence it reshapes simply by existing. That night, when the wind carried no howls and the stars blinked without rhythm, when the porch wood stopped creaking and even the coyotes held their breath behind distant ridges, the cowboy felt it, not saw, not heard, but felt a soft and undeniable warmth rising from the far corner of his land, the one he never walked to anymore, the one that once had a shed that collapsed in a winter storm 15 years ago and never got rebuilt, because some places were better left to return to dust. Yet now that corner breathed different, as if the earth beneath it had remembered something, and he stood at his door. Eyes narrowed against the dark that looked too still, too calm, and he thought perhaps it was just the memory of a fire, or the ghost of one. The kind left behind by men who no longer needed light, but still left embers in the ground as a signal, as a story. So he didn't walk toward it, not yet, but let the night speak in fragments, the way the air didn't move, the way his breath stayed warm in his throat, the way his skin prickled not from cold, but from being watched by something, not eyes, not wind, but presence. And as minutes stretched into a silence that pressed against the edges of sense, he felt it again, heat, soft and steady, without flame, without glow, without smoke, and it unsettled him more than any sound could, because fire always declares itself. It flickers, it dances, it rises and fades. But this heat was different. This was remembering. This was the kind of warmth that stays after someone leaves a place, not with haste, but with care. And for the first time in decades, the cowboy knew he wasn't alone on his land. Not because someone shouted or knocked or lit a torch, but because someone knew how to be there without being seen. How to make a mark not on the ground, but in the air, in the soil, in the temperature that wraps itself around your bones when everything else refuses to move. And so he stepped off the porch, slowly, like the old horse he no longer saddled, each footfall weighed with not fear but caution, not curiosity but reverence, because if someone knew how to warm the land without touching it, they also knew how. To listen to the man who had not spoken in 20 years. And when he reached the edge of the invisible circle of heat, when his boots sunk an inch into softer dirt, he paused not because he was afraid, but because the heat was sacred, and whatever had made it had done so not to be found, but to be felt. And maybe that was the message. The ritual, the quiet ceremony of return, of presence, of knowing that some fires do not burn wood or spit smoke into the sky, but burn within time itself, marking moments instead of trees, and he stood there, bareheaded beneath the stars, eyes open but unblinking, heart slow but not still. And let the warmth pass through him like a memory that had never left, like a name that had not been said but was still remembered by someone. Somewhere far enough to not be seen, close enough to be known. It was not the wind that caught his attention that morning, nor the sunlight folding over the hills like a blanket stirred by time, nor the birds that had been silent for 2 days as if holding vigil over something unseen, but rather it was the stillness of the fence itself, the weathered wooden line that marked where his land ended and the forgotten stories began. The one he had built not to keep things out, but to remember what once passed through, and there, precisely centered on the middle beam. Neither dropped nor flung, was a single glove, worn but not torn, dark from the sun but not dusty, hanging, in a way that did not speak of carelessness but intention, the kind of placement that suggested a ritual, an offering, or a message. And though gloves were common on the range, lost often by riders too busy to notice, there was something in the curl of its fingers, the tension in the stitched leather, the way it rested, not limp but upright, that made him stop before he even reached it, made him look not at it but around it, at the surrounding earth that bore no fresh prints, at the fence rail that bore no scratches, and at the morning air that seemed to hold its breath as he stepped forward, his boots whispering against the dry ground. And he reached out but didn't touch it, not yet, because something about the glove was familiar. Not in sight, not even in shape, but in weight, a kind of memory that lived in the knuckles. In the way, the cuff bent inward like a nod, and he realized. His hand remembered the pressure before his mind did, that years ago there was a handshake. A single moment of trust with a man who never spoke his name, only rode alongside for 1 season. Long enough to matter, and then disappeared into the dust, like all riders do. And now that same pressure returned through a glove left behind. Not as a warning, but as a greeting. As if saying, I was here. I remember, and maybe you do too. And the cowboy leaned on the fence post, his shoulder brushing the splintered top rail. And let the silence return, not as emptiness, but as answer. And the glove hung there between them like a shared secret, soft in its stillness, heavy in its honesty. And he wondered not who had left it, but how they had known where to place it, so that it would be found without being searched for, so that it would speak without sound, so that it would say what men like them no longer needed to say aloud, that sometimes a gesture is enough, that sometimes a single object, familiar and unclaimed, can carry more weight than a saddlebag full of letters. And as he finally lifted it, feeling the shape collapse slightly in his palm, he did not cry, he did not smile, he did not turn to look beyond the hills for an answer, because the glove was not a clue, nor a trailhead, but a return, a memory made real. A proof that someone else out there still remembered him not as the man who vanished into 20 years of silence, but as the one who once stood beside another fire, long extinguished, but never forgotten. It wasn't the kind of morning that woke you with birdsong or golden lights slipping between shutters like an invitation to rise. It was the kind of morning that arrived gently, unnoticed, as if the night itself had stayed too long and forgot to leave properly, and somewhere in that thin veil between darkness and day, he felt it, not a sound, not a word, but a shift, a pull, something soft and weightless yet impossible to ignore, something that moved not through the air, but through the silence itself. The kind of silence that sits heavy on the chest and makes breathing feel ceremonial, and in that silence, carried not on the wind, but deeper, beneath it was something like a voice, or the ghost of a voice, or maybe only the memory of one, rising not from the hills or the trees or the long-forgotten trails, but from somewhere within, from a place buried so deep that he hadn't known it was still listening, a place that had gone untouched for 20 years, but now stirred as if someone had called to it by name, not his name. But the name that only one person had ever spoken, the name that existed only between them, shaped not by letters, but by history, and though the wind around the cabin had shifted 100 times before, though it had screamed and whispered and wept in storms and droughts alike, this breeze, this breath, felt different. It pressed against him like a hand on his back, not pushing, not pulling, just ... Steadying, and for a moment he stood completely still. The same way he had all those mornings on the porch watching the nothingness, waiting for it to change, but this time it was different, not because something appeared, but because something was felt, because something in his chest opened like a letter long sealed. And he didn't hear a word in the way most people hear. He didn't recognize a voice the way memory usually works. But he knew without question that someone, somewhere, had remembered him just then, had thought of him not as a stranger or a ghost, but as someone once known and still known. And that knowledge rang louder than any sound he'd heard in 2 decades. Echoing not in his ears, but in the hollow places that time had carved into him. And he closed his eyes, not because he needed to see it, but because the feeling was enough, because the moment had found him and asked nothing in return. And though no one stood outside his door, and no message hung from the fence, and the fire pit remained cold and the horses silent, he knew this was not imagination nor dream. This was the kind of truth that comes in silence, that travels through miles of forgotten dust and past unfinished sentences, the kind that survives where everything else fades. And he breathed in, slow and shaking, as if trying to inhale the name that had just passed through him. And maybe he succeeded. Maybe that breath was all that was needed to complete the loop, to say, I hear you. I remember too, I never truly left, and when he exhaled, something loosened inside him. Something that had been tight for so long it had forgotten what softness felt like, and though the sky remained pale and empty, and the hills unchanged, and the world quiet as ever, he knew something had shifted, that today was not the same as yesterday. Not because of what he heard, but because of what he felt, and that was enough. He had opened that door 1,000 times before, each time to wind and sky and dust, to the silence of unclaimed land stretching endlessly outward like a question never answered. But this morning, when the latch fell and the hinges groaned in there, familiar tiredness, when the cold wood pulled away from the frame as it always did, something had changed, not with noise or color or thunderous movement, but with arrangement, with intention, with something so quiet it could only be seen, not heard. For there, pressed into the brittle dirt that had for so long refused to keep anything, were hoofprints, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, circling not outward toward the open range or the pass or the places where men ride to be forgotten, but inward, gently, deliberately, forming a ring that faced his home, not surrounding it in warning or enclosing it in threat, but holding it. Like arms hold a memory or a fire holds its glow, and he stood motionless at the threshold, as if any step forward might break the fragile spell of the scene before him, a map made of dust and weight and choice. And in that circle he saw what 20 years of solitude had never shown him, that some arrivals leave no sound, that some goodbyes are shaped like returns, and that presence, when it means something, does not shout, it kneels, it waits, it leaves. No damage, only signs, only echoes, only proof that someone stood here and chose not to keep riding. And maybe the prints were all different, some wider, some deeper, some light enough to be mistaken for wind-marked, but they all curved toward the house, toward the porch where he'd sat through seasons and endings and hours that forgot to move. And he realized then that not all circles are for trapping, some are for keeping. Some are not lines to cross, but shapes to belong to. And maybe, just maybe, this wasn't about him at all. Wasn't about the years he'd spent measuring time by sunsets and repairs and the way his own boots wore down in the toe. Maybe it was about them, the riders, the ones who had come not to speak or to stay, but to say something in the only way they knew how, with presence and quiet and a gesture that asked for nothing. And the circle they left wasn't a fence or a boundary or a warning. It was a welcome, not written in ink or spoken in words, but drawn in the ground by those who knew that not every door needs knocking, that some people just need to know someone stood close enough to care, close enough to mean it, close enough to leave a trace and not erase it. And as he stood there, breath thick with morning, heart still too cautious to believe, something in him settled, not like sleep, not like peace, but like a man finally returning to the breath he forgot to finish 2 decades ago, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he did not look to the horizon for movement or the trail for dust or the barn for shadow. He looked down at the shape in the dirt that faced his home and felt without question that the silence he had worn, like a coat, had finally been seen and answered and folded neatly at his feet